Thank you very much. Thank you guys very much for allowing me the time and space, and how powerful the sangha and the meditation was right now for me. It's a reminder of how close peace is. Um, so to summarize how I got to where I'm at today, just being present with you all. I'll go back, start early, and then I'll walk towards how I got involved with the practice of meditation. So my mother's a first generation Mexican American, and my father is a Mexican national. Um, the reason why I even mention them is because they had a lot to do with the shaping of my core beliefs. And when I say core beliefs, I mean self, others, and world. Um, at a very young age, I have very few memories of my father. I came to understand that my parents were divorced at the age of 3, so I don't have too many memories of them actually separating, or when exactly he became absent in my life. What I do know is that I was loved dearly by my mother, her sisters, my grandmother, um, a lot of aunts. I also had a lot of uncles, but for some reason something was missing. Um, so as a child going into elementary school, I was teased a lot. I guess because my first of all, my name is Joshua, and the other Hispanic kids would say that you're a white boy, you're a white boy. Um, and to me, that was hurtful. I didn't understand because everything in the household, everything that I grew up around, um, was came from a certain culture. There was Spanish music on. There was a lot of Mexican food in the household, and I don't believe that other cousins and family members of mine experienced that. So I remember coming home crying a lot, and I remember begging my mom, like, why did you name me, like, why did you name me Joshua, like these kids are teasing me. And I would come home crying often, and I know I remember the suffering of that as a child. And I also remember when I learned how to adapt or adopt the activities of other kids in order to relieve myself from being teased. Um, so little by little, I gradually started to become mischievous. I started to I, I was magnetized towards a group of kids. The kids that were teasing me were the kids that I wanted the attention from, and a lot of these kids were troubled. Um, it, Later on in the future, we all ended up becoming from the same street gang. But as a kid, I remember that I was really really scared of being rejected. I remember my grandfather was probably the greatest guide that I've ever had in my life. He was a man of integrity. He was a very kind person. He was very compassionate. He was very peaceful. Um, and I'm fortunate to this very day to have had him as an example. So he stepped in and filled the void enough for me not to even notice that my father was not in my life. Um, so a friend of mine, when I was 11 and he was 12, was shot. Um, he was a 12-year-old kid. He got shot in the face 7 times. This is like a week before summer. And I remember that my mom was terrified, and as any mother would be. So she came up with a desperate idea to send me to Mexico, where my father was now married with children. Um, and she looked at it as a good idea for me to draw closer to the Plascencia family. I wasn't thrilled about it personally. I remember that clearly, not wanting to leave my friends. Um, but now looking back in retrospect, I can see the fear and the anxiety that she must have had to have experienced, a kid that used to come to her house murdered, and how close in age me and him were, and probably how much we looked alike, and the people we socialized with. It was the same circle. So she probably told herself that if it could happen to him, it could happen to my son. So I didn't have much choice, and I ended up in Mexico. Um, while in Mexico, I developed the social skill of just adopting what other people do in order to be accepted. So as I was um, navigating through a completely different world, a world that seemed maybe 10 to 15 years behind what the United States was. I remember having to warm up the water before we showered, certain things that were different. But I began socializing with older, I can say now that they were men. They were in their 20s, and I was 12 years old. And I was drinking a lot. So at this time, the first year that I went, I was already experimenting with alcohol, and I was already smoking weed. And I was doing whatever I felt I had to do to feel safe within myself and socially accepted. Um, so I didn't regret going to Mexico because it was a wonderful experience. My father was never family oriented. He was, even there with his new family, he had the same issues he had with my mother. He was very distant. His value system was friends first, family second. So he came home to sleep, and he did the rest of his time awake with his friends, socializing, which coincidentally I picked up as an adult. But coming back from Mexico, um, my mom had been in the process of remarrying, and she married a man that was extremely violent. He hit his kids. I remember CPS got involved with a few times when he hit his daughter Shauna, my sister Shauna, and he really had this dominant power and control thing going on in the household. When he came home from work, he was upset. He would work 12-hour shifts, and he would demand whatever he wanted when he came home. It wasn't done with kindness. He wasn't asked um, in a respectful manner. He wasn't courteous to nobody. He demanded food. He demanded homework to be done. He demanded people to get off the phone, to the point of pulling the cords out of the wall so my sister wouldn't use the phone anymore. She was a teenager. She was probably about 16 or 17. And I wasn't accustomed to this type of violence. My mom was very kind. And, unfortunately, my mom doesn't have a disciplinarian bone in her body. I don't think I've ever been spanked by my mother, um, which ultimately in the future I developed. I had no fear of consequence because I never had consequences as a child. Healthy consequences were never given to me. But on one occasion, I remember my stepfather punching my stepbrother. We're about the same age. Punched him right in the chest and knocking him to the floor. He couldn't breathe. And I remember him ripping a door off of the hinges completely so we couldn't close the door anymore. Um, and he approached me with his fist balled up, and I asked him, I said, "Hey, what are you going to do? Like, Are you going to hit me, or what are you doing? And he says, I will. I'm not scared to hit you. And I said, well, you're not my father. You can't touch me. I was already a kid that thought he knew it all. And I said, hey, look, I don't have to deal with this. Like, you're not my dad. You're not going to touch me. And I didn't marry you. My mom married you, and I don't have to deal with this. So he kind of came towards me, and I took off running out of the house. I remember walking to my grandmother's house. It's probably a half a mile away. And I remember not having shoes on. I remember jumping a fence and running and going through. I thought maybe he would chase me, and he didn't. Um, and I believe that was the last night I ever spent at my mother's house at the age of 12. So in that time, my grandfather, Frank, um, became really ill. And I didn't know why then, but now that I'm older, and now that I've done the work, and I've looked back at things that happened, certain experiences of my life, certain events that took place within my family, I can see now that I believe my grandfather was paying my mother's rent. It was a 2-story house in the city of Cerritos. It was expensive. Um, and I think he may have been keeping that a secret from my grandmother. And he was experiencing a lot of stress, and he had a couple strokes, and he had a heart attack. And on one specific occasion, he had a heart attack where they pulled me out of my junior high school, one of my older cousins, and said, hey, you need to come to the hospital. Grandpa's not going to make it. The doctor gave him a 5% chance to live. So I wasn't familiar with death. I was not clear as to what took place with my friend who was murdered a year earlier. So I remember being by his side at the hospital. He had a bunch of IVs and he was on life support, but he made it out. Miraculously, he came back out of that. He didn't remember a lot of names. It came back to him later on, prior to his passing. But I guess the stroke had really messed up his memory, and it was really difficult for me to see that because I didn't understand what those kind of things were. But I remember promising myself that I would tell him that I loved him every single day. So I did. I think he lived, I want to say, almost another year. I think he lived about 9 to 10 months before passing peacefully in the bed with my grandmother. But as these things were happening, I was preparing myself to go back to Mexico for the second summer, which I did. Um, and and I also get to hear the stories of other adults that remember me becoming an alcoholic. So at the age of 12, I was a blackout drunk. Um, I would go to parties, and over there, it's there's rum and coke and presidente and coke and all these, all it's all, I wasn't drinking beer. I was drinking really hard alcohol, hard liquor. And it was a common thing for me 5 days out of the week at least to be hungover, throwing up, and going through those things. And I was also, I'm dealing with, at the age of 12 or 13, I'm hanging out with men that are 25 years old. So we're socializing with women. We're doing all these things that a normal 13-year-old kid doesn't do. And that was the beginning of my addiction. That was the beginning of me becoming an alcoholic. Coming back to the States after that occasion, drinking was everything. We were ditching school, doing beer runs, um, going to ditch parties, and that became like the everyday norm, was to get drunk every day. I didn't realize until the work that I've done that I was grieving, and that I didn't know how to soothe the suffering and the pain that I was experiencing from the loss of my grandfather. So I made it back to Mexico one last time. I think I was 14 the last time I went, and I was fighting a lot. I got a lot of attention from the girls in Mexico, maybe because of being from California, being from the United States, the way I dressed, whatever ideas or dreams they may have had. Um, but I remember at least 15 occasions where men would follow me home and wait for me by my dad's house and to fight me. Fortunately, that there was no, like, they didn't use knives. Fortunately, they didn't have guns. Um, Fortunately, they were fist fights, but they were grown men. Some of these men were well into their 30s, and I was like 14 years old, and it just became normal for me to be violent and to kind of strike first, I can say, right? Um, so coming back from that, um, I experienced some more death in between that time. A few of my friends had passed away. I carried a few caskets, um, and I began drawing closer and closer towards my gang. These were people that I grew up with. I think I was replacing, in my mind, unconsciously, I was replacing my mother and my absent father with these individuals that were showing me what I believe to be love, what I believe to be understanding and security. And I my value system became exactly what my father's was. It was friends first and family second. So in this process, I met the mother of my children. She was molested from the age of 3 to the age of 8 years old. I wasn't aware of it. Um, we were already sexually active at a very young age. So I became a father at the age of 15. She was 14. And during a hospital visit, we were told to sit down, and we were informed that she was HIV positive. So a lot of my family was trying to convince me not to stay. They were trying to convince me to not play Russian roulette with my life, and that, there's a lot of women out there, and just to let this go. And something in my heart, something that my grandpa Frank taught me was, I, I wouldn't be able to live with myself abandoning this girl. So I justified staying with her, but being a cheater, being selfish, um, and acting like, or believing that I was a good person because I was with her. But in reality, I can see now that I caused more harm. Um, so with this news, having a new child, getting my license, starting to work at the age of 16, uh, I was living a life as an adult, but at the same time, I was living two lives. I was also gang banging. I was also doing everything that I believed that I had to do to appease my friends. Um, I was terrified of the idea of being rejected, so I did everything in my power not to. And if that meant to sacrifice my family to maintain the acceptance of my friends, I would do that. Um, and ultimately, I did. Ultimately, um, at the age of 24, I gave somebody a ride. I guess it was a drug deal. I picked them up from East LA, and I dropped them off in the city of Watts. I left them. Apparently, it turned into a kidnap, and I was arrested 5 months later. I I believed at the time that the system everything would work itself out, and the truth would come from the testimonies of witnesses and things of that nature. I really did believe that the system was gonna work to my favor. But I also do remember that during the interview with the officers, or the sheriffs, they told me, "Hey, if you don't tell your story, we're going to tell your story for you. And I promise you that you're going to do a life sentence." And I can see now the power of attitude. And I remember kind of having a screw you attitude towards authority at the time. I didn't trust people in authority, possibly because of my parents, possibly because I felt the senses of betrayal from them. I think that carried into my overall idea of what authority was and how I'm supposed to relate to it. So I remember basically telling them, um, handcuffed in my boxers because it was an early morning raid. I remember telling them to screw themselves and that I don't care what they do. Um, I didn't do nothing and I don't care. And so, you know, I was reckless, and ultimately my family, we ended up paying about $250,000 to go to trial. So in prison, in the jail system, I stood in LA County for about 4 years, maybe 4.5, and I began to sell drugs. It was it was a social skill that I developed. It was something that um, kept me safe from being teased. It kept me safe. It kept me safe from rejection, and it kept me safe from it kept me in a really safe emotional place. And in the process, I started using my skills, my social skills, to benefit gang members that were extremely powerful, gang members that were also extremely callous. Um, and I got really involved in drug dealing and politics in the county jail. And I remember when I finally, after all those years of LA County jail, and I remember entering the prison system almost 5 years later. And when I got to Lancaster, there was about 10 gang unit officers waiting for me with cameras. And I had no idea what was going on. I never experienced prison. Um, and that was the beginning of my journey. And I continued with my attitude against authority. I felt like I was a victim. I believed in my heart that I was not there, that I shouldn't have been there, that they made a mistake, and I was going to show them. And if I was going to be there, I was going to be comfortable. So, unfortunately, doing that and believing that truly came at the expense of thousands of people. I was notorious for selling drugs in prison. Um, and all of the traumas that I experienced, all of the abuse, all of the poverty, all of the absence of father and the absence of mother, and um, I know that I inflicted those same things onto other children. I know that my greed, I know that my idea of being entitled to comfort, I know that it costed a lot, and it's immeasurable. Uh, um, and it took some time for me to get to. In the midst of me being deeply involved in those things, those negative things in prison, um, there was something about self-help groups that was attracting me. Um, so in 2015, I get to Pleasant Valley State Prison. Immediately, people knew who I was. Um, we were on a lockdown the day of orientation. There was a 300-man riot with a rival gang on the yard in 2014, I believe. Um, and they were pulling us out, and they were pulling out people of influence, and they kept pulling me out as a person of influence to bring peace to this, to the turmoil that was going on between these two gangs. And I didn't see my ego at the time. I can see it now. I can see that the power and control was, it was, I was intoxicated with it. Um, So in this process, I became the MAC rep, which means that I basically am a prison lawyer for other prisoners to make sure they get what they have coming. And in the process, me and a couple other men of different races and ethnicities would team up, and we would do what we could to bring more groups to the yard, to bring peace to the yard. Um, I was still in the midst of all of my nonsense. So I remember, like, just to prevent violence on the yard, I would pay people's debts, up to $3,000, I think was the biggest debt that I paid, just to make sure that there was no bloodshed, that there was no people getting hurt, because I was interested in the economy, and I knew that violence on the yard was not going to be a good thing. I knew that to keep the economy right, that it had to be peaceful. So in that process, I believe the parliamentarian of the MAC committee told me that he was going to start a meditation group. And I had no idea what it was. I didn't really care. He knew that I was a high profile inmate. He knew that if I walked into the room, that people would follow. He knew that if I told people to go, that people would go. So he was really proud of what he was doing, as he should have been. And I can thank him from the beginning now for the gift that he gave me. So we sat in the program office. There was an empty room. We can literally hear all the officers and lieutenants and captains and people coming in and out of this office. We could hear the alarms. We can hear the man downs. We can hear the ambulance taking people off the yard, throughout these meditation sessions. And he introduced me to something called anapanasati meditation, which is a breath counting meditation. It was extremely powerful. I think he caught my attention when he told me that our mind was like a wild horse, and if you were to tie a wild horse to a post, it's going to kick and scream and pull and tug and make all the noises that it, to try to get away from the restraint. But there's going to come a point, he said, that this wild horse will tame itself. There's going to come a point where this wild horse will no longer have the energy to pull and kick. And at some point that this wild horse is going to realize that it can only go in a very circular motion. And it's going to be restricted to anything past those limits. And he was able to describe how our brains are pretty much the same. He said, you guys are going to notice, this is prior to our first meditation session, he said, you guys are going to notice that as you're attempting to count your breaths, you're going to lose count. Thoughts are going to come in. You're going to probably be thinking about your hot pot or your food or your visit that's coming up or other things. And everything that he described to about 10 of us that were in the room, it all happened. None of us were able to get to 100. And he would allow us to speak about those things. After the meditation, he would ask us, what did you guys notice? What did you guys notice about your breath? Were they short breaths? Was any breath identical? And it was obvious that those things weren't. But we had an open discussion about those things. And I didn't think it was going to work. It took maybe the third attempt to where I was actually able to count all the way to the 100. And during the conversation of that, I remember telling him how surprised I was, because not only was I able to count my breaths and pay attention, to look inward and to identify, the sensations of my breath, but I was also able, at the same exact time, to pay attention to what conversations were happening, alarms that were going off, but I was able to retain the count. So I started to realize that as I was practicing this meditation, that I was able to focus and concentrate better. And it was really powerful. I didn't know at this point, I didn't know when this meditation or where it was going to come in handy in my life. And I'll get to that, where I'm at today. So I transferred out. I went to another prison. I stood involved in gangs. I stood involved in drug dealing, and I was doing everything in my power to stay accepted amongst my peers. But I stayed persistent in these groups. There was no meditation, unfortunately, at Avenal State Prison, but at some point, I believe September of 2018, I was transferred over to Soledad State Prison, CTF, in Monterey. And it was here that I was amongst, there was high profile gang members here. And I remember right before I landed there, my wife had informed me that she had a really bad cough for a couple months, and we couldn't understand why. She went and got checked, and she had informed me while I was in the hole. I went to the hole, and she informed me that she had something called systematic scleroderma, which is an immune disease, and she had a terminal illness. And it was here within this 120-day period in the hole that I didn't know what tomorrow looked like. I started to experience like really, really bad anxiety. It was the summer. It was a heat wave. I think I was in San Luis Obispo on the 3rd tier. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they just would not expand. They would go about halfway, and I would panic, and I would take 4 or 5 bird baths a day because I would have these panic attacks. And I know now that some of that was coming from the knowledge that I knew deep down inside that I had to change. I knew deep down inside that my identity, this wasn't going to continue to work for me. Selling drugs and being this leader wasn't going to continue to work, and nor was I going to be able to relive losing another loved one. You know, the mother of my children had passed away in 2011 of AIDS. Um, so I had 2 abandoned children, and now my wife is sick. And I remember making the decision that I wasn't going to do this anymore. Um, and I remember that I had to face my greatest fear, and that greatest fear was to face this social, like, mass rejection. Like, there was people that just refused to shake my hand. There was people that wanted nothing to do with me. They would walk out of a room when I walked into a room, and it was one of the hardest things that I've ever experienced, to a point where I had actually an issue with my left eye where I had I couldn't, my central vision started messing up. I was so attached to this identity. I was so attached to this power and control, and these pats on the back, and this lifestyle, and all the rewards that I believed came from them, that it was affecting me physically. So the anxiety ultimately turned into other physical ailments. Um, and it was here in this prison during a 4-year lockdown because of another riot with the same rival gang, that I was introduced to the meditation, Buddhist meditation here at CTF. There at CTF, I should say. A friend of mine named Roy Duran actually invited me in prior to, once he was found suitable. Um, I was actually present during Nutvo's um, last meditation session, during his goodbyes. It was very powerful. He was obviously a pillar to that practice and that group specifically. There was never a lot of people there, but I still somewhat I had this charisma to continue to bring people in. I still had my leadership skills. I didn't lose that. I didn't lose my kindness. I didn't lose my compassion. I didn't lose my ability to make people feel a certain way. Um, I just stopped helping the bad people, and I started helping good people. And I remember there were times where there was just 2 of us, in two actual um, incarcerated individuals, to 3 people that were coming from the outside. And I remember bringing as many people into this practice as I could. Um, so I was able to meet John and Yosh. Some of you may or may not know John and Yosh. I was in awe with the intellect that John has. I was in awe with the spirit of Yosh and her knowledge of basketball. Outside of the conversation of meditation, she can tell you stats about almost any player in the NBA, which was amazing to me because she was like a really small, older Asian lady that just knew more about sports than I would have ever imagined. I would have never thought. And they were so different, but they were so connected. through this practice, and it was amazing to see. It was something that I want for myself. I also know from experience that it's not an easy sell. Not every, you experience this meditation and these sensations and the rewards of meditation, and you want to give it away to the people you love, but the people you love don't understand how powerful it is. They don't understand, um, and it's hard to find the right words to convince people how amazing meditation is. Um, Soon after, I got to meet Dora, Natasha, and Nancy. I think Nancy was one of the last that came in prior to my release from CTF. I got to sit with her a few times, a few different sanghas, and it was a blessing. I mean, just the I think I want to say Janie, Jeannie, it's Jeannie, and she's probably here. Hey, Jeannie, I love you guys. Um, we started communicating, and it was just this was the only group. And thank you to the person who told me in the chat, like, make sure to serve, like, when you're serving others, make sure that you serve yourself, because that has not always been my strength. And I know, this was the only group that I had that was for me to replenish myself and rejuvenate myself. Every other group, I was bound to these facilitation um, assignments and presentations and all these things. There was a lot of tension and pressure to do those things, but this was the only group that was for me to find peace and keep peace. And real quick, because I feel like I'm already passing my time. Um, Keeping peace. I remember coming home from CTF, and I walked into my grandmother's house, and there was 70 people here. This is my first night out of prison. Everybody's tense, everybody's anxious, except me. Right? So all of this meditation that I had been doing from 2015 on to now, it was like this stored calmness that I had. I didn't know when I was going to use it. I didn't know when I was going to need it. But this calmness came over me, and everybody that was asking me, like, hey, how do you feel after 19 years or after 18 and a half years of prison? How do you feel? And I said, I feel at peace. I feel calm. And it's because of this practice that I can plug into this calmness when there's chaos, and it's extremely powerful. And again, I'm trying to find the right words to convince everybody that I care for, and everybody in general that I come in contact with, to give meditation a chance. I feel like I may have went over my time. I want to thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to speak and share some of my story. There's a lot more, but I did my best to summarize what I could. Thank you very much.